I still remember that night, the cold, sharp ache when the electrician crouched down, looked under the worn floorboards beneath my son's bedroom, and whispered, "Ma'am, you need to see this." I was shattered, clutching his childhood photo, wondering how much of him I never knew, hidden right beneath my feet. The silence in that moment cut deeper than any words ever could. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Margaret, and at 73 years old, I thought I knew everything about my son David. I thought I understood the weight of sacrifice, the rhythm of giving, the quiet ache of a mother's love. But sometimes, the people closest to us carry secrets so heavy they crack the very foundations we stand on. And sometimes, those secrets live right beneath our feet, waiting to surface when we least expect them. The morning everything changed started like any other in our cramped Queens apartment. The radiator clanged its familiar tune, steam hissing through pipes that had seen better decades. I could hear the early morning traffic below, delivery trucks rumbling past, construction workers shouting in languages that painted our neighborhood with diversity. The scent of Mrs. Chen's dumplings from the apartment next door mixed with the staleness that seemed to cling to our walls lately. I shuffled to the kitchen in my worn slippers, the ones with the hole near the left toe that I kept meaning to throw away but couldn't bear to part with. My pillbox sat on the counter like a rainbow of resignation, white for blood pressure, blue for arthritis, yellow for the heart condition I pretended didn't scare me. Each pill a reminder that time was slipping through my fingers like sand. The coffee maker gurgled to life, and I stood there waiting, staring out the window at the brick building across the narrow courtyard. Mrs. Rivera was already hanging laundry on her fire escape, her movements deliberate and practiced. She waved when she saw me, and I managed a small wave back, though my heart wasn't in it. I had sent David a text the night before. Simple words: lunch tomorrow? 2 p.m.? Miss you. The message showed as read, but no response came. Just the cold blue check marks that seemed to mock my hope. This had become our pattern. I would reach out, he would read, and silence would follow like a shadow I couldn't shake. My husband Frank had stopped noticing these small rejections years ago, or maybe he just stopped caring. He'd grunt from his chair, newspaper perpetually hiding his face, beer bottle sweating rings on the coffee table even though it wasn't even noon yet. I used to make excuses for David. He's busy, I'd tell myself. He's 38 now, has his own life, his own problems. But deep down, in that place where mothers keep their most tender wounds, I knew something had changed between us. The boy who once ran to me with scraped knees and bad dreams had become a stranger who saw me as little more than an ATM with emotions. The electrician was scheduled to come that Monday morning because the lights in David's old room had been flickering for weeks. David didn't live with us anymore, hadn't for 3 years, but his room remained frozen in time, like a shrine to the son I used to know. Baseball trophies gathering dust, posters of bands from the 90s curling at the edges, a closet full of clothes he'd grown out of but I couldn't bring myself to donate. When the doorbell rang at 10 sharp, I expected a quick fix. Maybe a loose wire, a faulty bulb. Something simple, something that wouldn't require me to disturb the careful burial ground of memories I'd maintained in that room. The electrician was a kind man named Tony, probably around 50, with calloused hands and eyes that had seen enough broken things to recognize the fragile when he encountered it. He nodded politely when I let him in, toolbox in one hand, work light in the other. "Should just take a few minutes, Mrs. Patterson," he said, his voice gentle in a way that reminded me of my father. "Probably just need to check the connections." I offered him coffee, which he declined with a smile, and then I retreated to the kitchen to give him space to work. I could hear him moving around above, footsteps creaking across the old hardwood that Frank had installed when we first moved here 42 years ago. Back then, we had dreams bigger than this apartment, plans that included a house in the suburbs, maybe a little garden where I could grow tomatoes and David could have a swing set. Life has a way of collecting dreams and filing them away in places you forget to look. After about 20 minutes, the footsteps stopped. Then I heard a sound that made my chest tighten, the slow scraping of wood against wood, like furniture being moved. Then silence. A long, heavy silence that seemed to press against the walls. "Mrs. Patterson?" Tony's voice drifted down the hallway, different now. Uncertain. "Could you come here for a moment?" I found him kneeling beside David's bed, 3 loose floorboards pulled up and leaning against the wall. His work light was pointed down into the opening, casting harsh shadows on his concerned face. When he looked up at me, I saw something in his expression that made my knees weak. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "I think you need to see this." I approached on unsteady legs, my slippers whispering against the floor. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. When I peered into the opening beneath the floor, my breath caught in my throat. There, in a space that shouldn't exist, was a metal lockbox. Around it, plastic bags were stuffed with what looked like electronics, phones, tablets, jewelry. Envelopes scattered like fallen leaves, some opened, some still sealed. The smell of damp wood and something else, something chemical, rose up to meet me. I was just trying to check the wiring, Tony said quietly. These boards were loose, and when I lifted them up, he gestured helplessly at the scene before us. I stared into that hole in my son's floor as if it were a portal to another dimension. Because in a way, it was. It was a window into a version of David I had never known existed, a secret life lived literally beneath my feet while I cooked his favorite meals and worried about his future. My hands were shaking as I reached for the lockbox. It wasn't locked, the irony wasn't lost on me. Inside, I found documents that made my vision blur. Credit applications in David's name using our address. Pawn shop receipts for items I recognized, my grandmother's ring that I thought I'd misplaced, Frank's watch that he'd been looking for months. Bank statements from accounts I didn't know existed, showing transactions that made my stomach turn. But it was the letter at the bottom that broke me. A letter addressed to Mom and Dad that David had apparently written but never sent. In it, he detailed his gambling debts, his cocaine habit, his plan to sell our apartment behind our backs when we died. He wrote about us with such casual cruelty, referring to me as the old lady and Frank as dead weight. He calculated our assets like we were already gone, divided our few possessions like items at an estate sale. The teacup I'd been holding slipped from my fingers and shattered against the hardwood floor. The sound echoed in the small room, sharp and final, like something important breaking that could never be put back together. Tony stood quietly beside me, giving me space to process what we'd uncovered. When I started crying, silent tears that felt like they'd been waiting years to fall, he simply said, "I'll come back another day to finish the wiring." But I couldn't let him leave. Not yet. Because suddenly, everything made sense. The missed birthdays, the ignored calls, the way David's eyes would dart around our apartment when he visited, calculating, assessing. The times I'd lent him money for emergencies that never quite added up. The way he'd grown cold and distant, especially after we'd refinanced our apartment and he'd asked pointed questions about our equity, our savings, our investment in stocks that we'd built up over decades of careful living. "How long do you think this has been here?" I asked Tony, my voice barely a whisper. He knelt down again, examining the wood, the way the floorboards had been carefully cut and replaced. "Judging by the wear patterns, the way the wood has settled, I'd say at least 2 years. Maybe longer." 2 years. 2 years of secret visits when Frank and I were out. 2 years of planning, scheming, hiding. 2 years of coming to family dinners and looking me in the eye while this treasure trove of betrayal lay buried in his childhood bedroom. I thought about all the times I'd defended him to Frank, who had grown increasingly suspicious of David's requests for money. I thought about the sacrifices I'd made, the nest egg I'd depleted, the stock investments I'd liquidated to help my son through what I thought were temporary rough patches. After Tony left, promising discretion and kindness in a way that reminded me there were still good people in the world, I sat alone in David's room surrounded by the evidence of his deception. The childhood photos on his dresser seemed to mock me, pictures of birthday parties where I'd spent money we didn't have to make him smile, graduation photos where pride had made me overlook the calculation already growing in his eyes. I called David that afternoon. For once, he answered on the second ring. "Mom? What's up? I'm kind of busy." "I need you to come over," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Tonight." "Tonight? I've got plans." "Can't it wait until, David?" The firmness in my own voice surprised me. "Come home. We need to talk." There was a pause. Then, "Is everything okay? You sound weird." I almost laughed at that. Weird. After 38 years of motherhood, after decades of putting his needs before my own, after discovering a cache of stolen goods and betrayal hidden in his bedroom floor, I sounded weird. "Just come home, son." He arrived at 8:45 minutes late, smelling like cigarettes and something sharper. His hair was messy, his clothes wrinkled, and when he hugged me hello, it felt performative, like he was playing a role he'd grown tired of. Frank was in his chair, basketball game on the television, but I could tell he was listening. We'd had a brief conversation after I'd called him at work, told him what I'd found. His reaction had been quieter than I expected, more resigned than surprised. "I wondered," was all he said. "I wondered for a while now." "So what's the emergency?" David asked, settling into the couch like he owned the place. Which, I realized with a sick feeling, he probably thought he eventually would. I had laid everything out on the coffee table. The documents, the receipts, the letter. I watched his face as his eyes took in the display, watched the color drain from his cheeks, watched his shoulders tense as his casual mask began to slip. "David," I said carefully, "we need to talk about what I found in your room today." For a long moment, he said nothing. Just stared at the evidence of his betrayal spread out like a poker hand he couldn't bluff his way out of. When he finally spoke, his voice was defensive, angry in a way that told me he'd been rehearsing this conversation in his head for months. You went through my stuff? The electrician found it, David. Found it hidden under floorboards you cut out and replaced. Found it when he was trying to fix the lights that have been flickering because of all the extra wiring you ran for whatever operation you've been running out of our apartment. He stood up abruptly, pacing to the window, hands running through his hair. You don't understand, Mom. You don't know what it's like out there. The pressure, the economy, the way everything costs more than it used to. So you decided to steal from us? I wasn't stealing. The words exploded out of him. That stuff, most of it was mine anyway. And the money I borrowed, I was going to pay it back. I just needed some time to get my Bitcoin investments back on track, to rebuild my portfolio. Bitcoin? Frank's voice cut through the room like a blade. You spent our money on cryptocurrency? David whirled around, his face flushed with frustration. It's not like that, Dad. I was diversifying, playing the market. Some of those investments were showing real returns before the market crashed. If you'd just given me more time, I could have tripled your assets, built us real wealth instead of just hoarding dollars in some pathetic savings account. I stared at my son, this stranger wearing my son's face, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. All those years of sacrifice, of putting his needs first, of believing that love meant giving until it hurt. And here he was, standing in our living room, justifying theft with investment terminology, treating our life savings like his personal capital to gamble with. What about this letter, David? I picked up the page where he'd written about us so cruelly. What about planning to sell our home out from under us? His face crumpled, but not with remorse. With the petulant anger of someone caught in a lie they'd told themselves so many times they'd started to believe it. I was thinking ahead, Mom. You and Dad aren't getting any younger. I was trying to plan for when you'd need care, when you couldn't handle this place anymore. By referring to me as the old lady? By calculating our net worth like we're already dead? I didn't mean it like that. But I could see in his eyes that he had meant it exactly like that. Maybe not consciously, maybe not with malice, but with the cold calculation of someone who had slowly stopped seeing us as people and started seeing us as assets to be managed, resources to be allocated. The room fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of the city below. Frank had turned off the television, and the apartment felt smaller somehow, like the walls were closing in on secrets that had grown too big to contain. I think you should leave, I said finally. Mom, come on. Let's talk about this rationally. I can explain everything. I think you should leave, and I think you should stay gone until you can look me in the eye and tell me the truth. The real truth. About the drugs, about the gambling, about how long you've been using our home as your personal warehouse. David's composure finally cracked completely. Fine. You want the truth? The truth is you've been suffocating me my whole life. Every phone call, every guilt trip about visiting more, every expectation that I should be grateful for things I never asked for. You want to know why I didn't tell you about my problems? Because I knew you'd react exactly like this, with drama and tears and making everything about how much you've sacrificed. The words hit me like physical blows. Frank started to stand, his face dark with anger, but I held up a hand to stop him. Because in that moment, I realized something important. I realized that David was right about one thing. I had been suffocating. Not him, but myself. Suffocating my own needs, my own worth, my own right to be treated with basic respect and honesty. Get out, I said quietly. Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't mean, get out of our house, David. And don't come back until you remember how to be a son instead of a vulture. He left that night with nothing but the clothes on his back and a promise that he'd call when I'd had time to think things through. The promise felt as empty as all the others he'd made over the years. Frank and I spent the rest of the evening in silence, him in his chair, me on the couch, both of us processing what had just unraveled in our living room. Eventually, he spoke. I'm sorry, Maggie. I should have said something sooner. Should have stood up to him instead of letting you handle everything. I looked at my husband of 45 years, this good man who had worked construction jobs until his back gave out, who had never complained about our small apartment or our modest means, who had trusted me to manage our family relationships while he focused on keeping us financially afloat. We both let it happen, I said. We both made him think it was okay. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of our building settling around us. Footsteps in the apartment upstairs, pipes creaking in the walls, the distant hum of traffic that never quite stopped in Queens. Sounds that had comforted me for decades now felt like a soundtrack to my own blindness. I got up around 2 a.m. and went to David's room. In the harsh light of the overhead bulb, the hole in the floor looked even more obscene, like a wound that had been festering in secret. I knelt down and gathered up all the remaining documents, all the evidence of betrayal that had been living beneath our feet like some terrible secret. Among the papers, I found more disturbing revelations. Email printouts discussing plans to have us declared mentally incompetent. Research on nursing homes and their costs. A handwritten list of our possessions and their estimated values, including items that held sentimental value he'd priced like commodities at an auction house. But the worst discovery came in a crumpled envelope I almost missed. Inside was a receipt from a pawn shop dated just 3 months ago. The item listed was my mother's wedding ring, the one I'd been saving to give to David's future wife. The one I thought I'd lost but had apparently just been stolen, sold for a fraction of its emotional worth to fund whatever latest crisis David had been hiding from us. I sat on his bedroom floor holding that receipt, and something fundamental broke inside me. Not my heart, that had been breaking slowly for years. What broke was my willingness to keep pretending that love meant accepting abuse, that being a mother meant being endlessly available for exploitation. The next morning, I did something I'd never done in 73 years of life. I called in sick to loving someone who was hurting me. I started by changing our locks. Frank protested at first, worried about the message we'd be sending, but I was firm. The message we're sending, I told him, is that our home is our sanctuary, not David's storage unit. Then I called our bank. I learned about something called financial abuse, about the ways adult children sometimes exploit elderly parents, about the signs I'd been missing or ignoring for years. I closed the joint savings account David had access to and moved our assets to new accounts he couldn't touch. Our small investment in stock market shares, the modest fortune we'd built through decades of careful living, our retirement funds, all of it was moved beyond his reach. The bank representative, a young woman named Sarah, was kind but direct. "Mrs. Patterson, I have to ask, has your son ever pressured you for money? Ever made you feel like you owed him financial support?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Had he? I thought about all the times he'd called with emergencies, all the guilt-laden conversations about how hard his life was, how much he needed just a little help to get back on his feet. I thought about how I'd liquidated bonds, cashed out stocks, depleted our capital to fund his various crises without ever asking hard questions about where the money was really going. "Yes," I whispered into the phone. "I think he has." That afternoon, I sat at our kitchen table with a legal pad, writing down everything I could remember. Every loan that was never repaid. Every emergency that required immediate financial assistance. Every time I'd felt guilty for questioning his stories or his needs. The list filled 3 pages and represented tens of thousands of dollars, money that could have secured our own future, improved our own lives, built a real inheritance instead of funding my son's deceptions. Frank found me there at dinner time, tears streaming down my cheeks as I calculated the cost of my own enabling. "How much?" he asked gently, settling into the chair beside me. $67,000, I said. "In 3 years. $67,000 that we'll never see again." He whistled low, a sound of amazement and pain. "That's more than my pension brings in annually." "I know. That's nearly all our liquid assets." "I know." He reached across the table and took my hand, his fingers rough from decades of honest work. "What do we do now, Maggie?" I looked at my husband, this man who had never asked me for anything beyond love and partnership, who had trusted me to manage our family relationships while he focused on providing for us. I thought about the life we'd built together, modest but honest, and how we'd let our son turn it into something twisted and transactional. "Now we learn how to live for ourselves," I said. The first week without David was harder than I'd expected, but not in the way I'd feared. I'd worried about loneliness, about guilt, about the empty space his absence would leave. Instead, what I felt was something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. No unexpected phone calls demanding immediate financial assistance. No tense visits where I watched my son calculate the value of our possessions with his eyes. No walking on eggshells, afraid to enjoy our modest prosperity because it might trigger another request for help. Frank and I began to rediscover rhythms we'd forgotten. We ate dinner together without interruption. We watched television shows we actually enjoyed instead of programs David preferred when he visited. I started reading again, something I'd abandoned when managing his various crises had consumed all my mental energy. But the real change came when Mrs. Rivera knocked on my door with a plate of homemade empanadas and an invitation. "Margaret," she said in her gentle way, "there's a book club at the community center. We meet Thursday evenings. I think you might enjoy it." I almost declined automatically, the way I'd been declining social invitations for years because David might need something, because family obligations came first, because I'd convinced myself that being a good mother meant being perpetually available. Instead, I heard myself saying, "I'd like that. Thank you." The book club met in a circle of folding chairs in a room that smelled like coffee and floor wax. There were 8 other women, all around my age, all carrying stories in their eyes that spoke of lives fully lived, of losses survived, of wisdom earned through experience rather than given through textbooks. That first evening, we discussed a novel about a woman who rediscovers herself after her husband's death. The parallels weren't lost on me. I felt like I was rediscovering myself after the death of my illusions about motherhood, about family, about the difference between love and enablement. Sometimes, said a woman named Dorothy, we have to grieve the people our children could have been in order to see clearly who they actually are. The words hit me like cold water, sharp and clarifying. I'd been grieving David for years without realizing it, mourning the loss of the sweet boy who had gradually transformed into someone I didn't recognize, someone whose presence in my life had become a source of stress rather than joy. It doesn't make us bad mothers, added another woman, Helen. It makes us honest mothers. That night, I went home and did something I hadn't done in years. I looked in the mirror, really looked, and tried to see myself as someone deserving of respect rather than someone desperate to prove her worth through sacrifice. The woman looking back at me was 73 years old, with silver hair I'd been coloring to look younger for David's sake, with lines around her eyes that spoke of worry more than laughter, with shoulders that had been carrying burdens too heavy for one person to bear. But there was something else there too, something I'd forgotten existed, strength. David called the following week. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to his message while sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and a resolve I'd never possessed before. Mom, it's me. I've been thinking about what happened, and I want to apologize. I know I hurt you, and I'm sorry. I've been going through some stuff, making some bad choices, but I'm getting help now. Can we talk? I miss you. I miss home. His voice sounded different, smaller, more vulnerable than it had in years. For a moment, my old instincts kicked in, the maternal impulse to soothe, to fix, to welcome him back without question. But then I thought about the hole in his bedroom floor. I thought about my mother's wedding ring in a pawn shop. I thought about the letter where he'd calculated our worth like we were already dead. I thought about $67,000 in assistance that had purchased nothing but more lies and manipulation. I didn't call him back that day. Or the next. Instead, I made an appointment with a therapist recommended by the bank's elder abuse counselor, a woman who specialized in helping older adults navigate complicated family dynamics. Dr. Martinez was younger than David, with kind eyes and a direct manner that reminded me of my own mother. She listened without judgment as I recounted the years of gradual erosion, the way my son had slowly transformed from a recipient of my love into someone who viewed that love as a resource to be exploited. Margaret, she said during our third session, what would it look like if you treated yourself with the same compassion you've been giving David all these years? The question stayed with me for days. What would it look like to prioritize my own well-being the way I'd prioritized his? What would it feel like to make decisions based on what I needed rather than what I thought he deserved? I started small. I bought myself flowers, something I'd always dismissed as frivolous. I scheduled a doctor's appointment I'd been postponing because the money had seemed better spent elsewhere. I called my sister in Florida, whom I'd been avoiding because I was ashamed of David's behavior and didn't want to burden her with family problems. Maggie, she said when I finally told her about everything that had happened, why didn't you call me sooner? You've been carrying this alone for so long. I thought it was my job, I admitted. I thought if I was a good mother, I could fix it. I could love him back to who he used to be. Honey, you can't love someone into being who they don't want to be. And you can't sacrifice yourself on the altar of their potential. Her words echoed in my head for weeks. The altar of their potential. That's exactly what I'd been doing, worshipping not who David was, but who I desperately wanted him to become, making offerings of money and forgiveness and endless chances that had only enabled his worst behaviors. Meanwhile, the book club had become a weekly refuge. These women, these survivors, these warriors disguised as grandmothers, understood parts of my experience I'd never been able to articulate. Dorothy's daughter was an addict who'd stolen from her repeatedly. Helen's son had maxed out credit cards in her name. Maria's grandson had been living rent-free in her basement while dealing drugs and bringing dangerous people around her home. We all did the same thing, Dorothy said one evening as we discussed a memoir about boundaries and self-respect. We confused enabling with love. We thought if we just gave enough, sacrificed enough, suffered enough, we could save them. And what we learned, Helen added, is that we can't save anyone who doesn't want to be saved. We can only save ourselves. I was beginning to understand that salvation wasn't something that happened to you, it was something you chose for yourself, every day, in small decisions and large ones, in the words you spoke and the boundaries you maintained. 6 months after I discovered David's hidden cache of betrayal, he showed up at my door unannounced. I was coming home from the grocery store, arms full of bags, when I found him sitting on the front steps of our building. He looked thinner than when I'd last seen him, hollow-eyed and shaky in a way that spoke of ongoing struggles with substances I'd been pretending not to notice for years. Mom, he said, standing as I approached. We need to talk. We need to, I agreed, but not like this. Not with you showing up unannounced expecting me to drop everything. He followed me upstairs, talking the entire time about changes he was making, help he was getting, promises he was ready to keep this time. I'd heard variations of this speech before, usually when he needed money or access to something I'd restricted. But something was different in his tone, a desperation that seemed less calculated than previous performances. In our apartment, Frank greeted David with careful neutrality, not warm, but not hostile. We sat around the same coffee table where I'd confronted him months earlier, but the dynamic had shifted fundamentally. I no longer felt like I was defending myself. I felt like I was protecting something precious that had taken me 73 years to recognize, my own worth. I've been in rehab, David said without preamble. 90 days. Just got out last week. That's good, I said carefully. I'm glad you're getting help. I want to make amends, Mom. I want to pay back what I owe you, explain what happened, rebuild what I broke. For months, I'd dreamed of hearing these words. But now that he was speaking them, I realized they weren't enough. Words were just sounds in the air unless they were backed by consistent action, and David's history was filled with beautiful words followed by devastating choices. What do you want from me, David? He looked surprised by the directness of the question. I want my family back. I want to come home. This isn't your home anymore, I said quietly. You gave up that right when you turned our home into your personal storage facility and ATM. Mom, I was sick. I am sick. Addiction is a disease. I know it is. And I hope you recover completely. But your disease doesn't obligate me to provide funding for your recovery, or housing, or unconditional forgiveness without accountability. He stared at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. You're my mother. Yes, I am. And for 38 years, I thought that meant I was supposed to sacrifice everything for you, fix all your problems, enable your worst choices in the name of love. I was wrong. So what are you saying? You're abandoning me. The word abandoning hit like a slap, loaded with all the guilt and manipulation he'd learned to wield so expertly. But instead of crumbling under its weight, I felt myself standing straighter. I'm saying I'm learning the difference between love and enabling. I'm saying that real love sometimes requires allowing people to face the consequences of their choices instead of constantly rescuing them from those consequences. David's face cycled through emotions, surprise, anger, hurt, calculation. I watched him search for the right approach, the right lever to apply to regain access to the resources he'd come to see as his birthright. What if I paid rent? What if I got a job and contributed to the household? David, you've had a job exactly twice in the past 5 years, and both times you were fired for theft. You've made promises about contributing to this household approximately 100 times, and you've kept none of them. Why would this time be different? He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a bitter edge I'd never heard before. I see. So Dr. Martinez got to you. The mention of my therapist's name sent a chill through me. How do you know about Dr. Martinez? I made some calls, asked around. Found out my mother is seeing a shrink who specializes in turning families against each other. The violation inherent in his words, the casual way he'd invaded my privacy and twisted my efforts at healing into something sinister, crystallized everything I'd been learning about boundaries and respect. Get out, I said quietly. Mom, I didn't mean, get out of my home. Now. You can't just, I can. And I am. I stood up, my voice gaining strength with each word. I will not be manipulated anymore. I will not be guilt-tripped or emotionally blackmailed or made to feel responsible for choices you made as a grown adult. I will not buy love that has to be purchased. And I will not allow you to turn my home into a battleground for your recovery. David looked at Frank, searching for an ally, but found only a man who had finally chosen to protect his wife instead of enabling his son. Dad? You heard your mother, Frank said simply. After David left that day, storming out with threats to never speak to us again, I experienced something I'd never felt before, relief. Not the relief of conflict ending, but the relief of finally choosing myself. That evening, Mrs. Rivera knocked on my door with tea and empanadas, as had become her custom when she sensed I'd had a difficult day. We sat at my kitchen table, and I told her about David's visit, about the guilt and anger and strange sense of freedom I felt. You know, she said, stirring honey into her tea, I had a similar conversation with my youngest son 5 years ago. He was 42 and still expecting me to solve all his problems while he created new ones. What happened? I gave him a choice. He could either start treating me like a person deserving of respect, or he could learn to live without me. It was the hardest thing I'd ever said to one of my children. And it took him 2 years. 2 years of silence, of him trying to turn other family members against me, of him spreading lies about how his cruel mother had abandoned him in his time of need. But eventually, he came back. Not looking for money or rescue, but looking to rebuild a relationship based on mutual respect instead of one-sided exploitation. How did you know the difference? How did you know when his change was real? Mrs. Rivera smiled, her eyes crinkling with hard-won wisdom. Because he didn't ask for anything. For the first time in 20 years, my son came to see me without wanting something from me. He just wanted to spend time with his mother. That night, I dream about David as a little boy. In the dream, he's 7 years old, crying because he's fallen off his bicycle and scraped his knee. I clean the wound, apply a bandage, kiss it better. He hugs me tight and promises to be more careful, and I believe him completely because in that moment, his promise was sincere. I woke up understanding something important. I could love the little boy David had been without enabling the man he'd chosen to become. Grief and love could coexist. I could mourn the loss of my innocent child while protecting myself from the adult who had weaponized my maternal instincts against me. The months that followed were unlike any I'd experienced in decades. Without the constant drain of David's crises and demands, Frank and I rediscovered why we'd fallen in love 45 years earlier. We took walks through the neighborhood, pointing out changes and sharing memories. We visited the small community garden 3 blocks away, where I volunteered to help tend the tomato plants, and Frank struck up conversations with other retired men who gathered there to escape apartments that had grown too quiet. I joined the book club permanently and even hosted a meeting in our apartment. 8 women crowded around our small dining table, discussing literature and life with the kind of frank honesty that comes with age and experience. For the first time in years, our home felt like a place of joy rather than a repository of family secrets and resentments. I also did something I'd dreamed about for decades but had always dismissed as selfish. I took an art class. Every Tuesday afternoon, I sat in a circle with 12 other people, learning to see shapes and shadows, to translate what my eyes perceived onto paper through charcoal and pencil. I wasn't particularly talented, but talent wasn't the point. The point was reclaiming parts of myself I'd set aside in the name of family obligation. My instructor, a patient man named Carlos, praised my drawing of an old building in our neighborhood. "You capture the dignity," he said. "The weight of years, but also the strength that comes with surviving." I thought about that phrase often, the strength that comes with surviving. I was beginning to understand that survival wasn't just about enduring hardship, but about emerging from it with your essential self intact, with boundaries drawn and lessons learned. 8 months after David's last visit, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a woman's voice asked if I was Margaret Patterson, David Patterson's mother. "Yes," I said carefully. "My name is Jennifer. I'm David's girlfriend." He's in the hospital, Mrs. Patterson. He asked me to call you." The old me would have dropped everything, rushed to his bedside, resumed the familiar role of crisis manager and emotional caretaker. The new me asked questions. "What happened?" "Overdose." "He's stable now, but this is the second time in 3 months. The social worker wants to talk to family about long-term treatment options." I felt the familiar tug of maternal obligation, the instinct to rescue and repair and make everything better through sheer force of love and will. But I also felt something new, the recognition that this was David's crisis to manage, not mine. "I'm sorry to hear he's struggling," I said. "But I won't be coming to the hospital, and I won't be discussing treatment options. David is 40 years old. These are his decisions to make. But you're his mother." "I am. And because I love him, I'm not going to enable his addiction by rescuing him from the consequences of his choices. If he wants family support in his recovery, he needs to demonstrate that he's committed to recovery, not just to avoiding consequences." Jennifer was quiet for a long moment. Then, that's really hard." "Yes, it is. Loving an addict is the hardest thing I've ever done. But I've learned that helping isn't always helpful, and love isn't always rescue." After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and processed the conversation. I felt sad for David, genuinely sad about his continued struggles with substances and whatever pain drove him to seek oblivion in chemicals. But I didn't feel responsible for fixing it, and I didn't feel guilty for maintaining the boundaries I'd worked so hard to establish. Frank found me there an hour later, staring out the window at Mrs. Chen hanging laundry on her fire escape. "David," he asked. "Overdose?" "He's okay, but he's in the hospital." Frank sat down across from me, his weathered hands folded on the table between us. "Are you going?" "No." He nodded once, a gesture of support that meant more than words could have conveyed. That evening, I called Dr. Martinez and left a voicemail updating her on the situation. She called back the next morning, full of warm support for the difficult choice I'd made. "How do you feel about it?" she asked. "Sad. But not guilty. For the first time in 40 years, I feel sad for my son without feeling responsible for his pain." That's tremendous growth, Margaret. The ability to maintain emotional connection without accepting inappropriate responsibility, that's one of the hardest things for parents of addicts to learn. I was learning that growth at 73 looked different than I'd expected. It wasn't about achieving some final state of perfection or wisdom, but about continuously choosing healthier patterns, better boundaries, more authentic relationships. It was about accepting that love could coexist with limits, that compassion didn't require sacrifice of self. 3 months later, David called me directly. Not from a hospital or jail or crisis center, but from what sounded like a quiet room where he'd had time to think. "Mom? It's David. I know you might not want to talk to me, but I was hoping I could see you. Just to talk. I wouldn't ask for anything. I miss you." I'd been dreading and dreaming of this call in equal measure. "Where are you, David?" "I'm in a residential program. 90 days clean. I've got a job in the kitchen here, and I'm working with a counselor who specializes in addiction and family relationships." "That's good. I'm glad you're getting help. I want to apologize. Really apologize, not just say the words because I need something from you. I want to apologize for the way I treated you and Dad, for the things I stole, for the lies I told. I want to try to understand how I became someone who could hurt you the way I did." His voice was different, steadier, less performative than I'd heard in years. But I'd learned to be cautious about hope, to require evidence rather than promises. "What do you want from me, David?" "Nothing. I want to give you something back. I want to give you a son you can be proud of instead of one you have to protect yourself from." We agreed to meet in a neutral location, a coffee shop near the treatment center where he was staying. I chose a public place deliberately, maintaining boundaries even as I cautiously opened the door to renewed contact. When I saw him walking toward my table, I almost didn't recognize him. He was thinner but healthier looking, his eyes clear in a way they hadn't been in years. He moved differently too, without the restless energy of someone constantly calculating angles or looking for exits. "Thank you for coming," he said, settling into the chair across from me. "I wasn't sure you would." I wasn't sure I would either. We sat in awkward silence for a moment, and I realized this was new territory for both of us. For years, our conversations had been driven by his needs, his crises, his demands. Neither of us knew how to interact without that familiar dynamic. "I've been working with a counselor," he said finally. "Talking about the things I did, trying to understand how I justified them to myself. And I want you to know, there's no justification. There's explanation, but no excuse." I listened as he talked about his addiction, his gambling, the gradual erosion of his moral boundaries as his need for money had grown more desperate. He talked about the cognitive dissonance of loving me while simultaneously planning to exploit me, the way addiction had transformed every relationship in his life into a potential resource to be mined. "I found out about the ring," he said quietly. "My grandmother's ring that I pawned. I want you to know I tried to get it back, but someone had already bought it. I wanted to at least return that piece of family history to you." I felt tears welling up, not for the ring itself, but for the acknowledgement, the recognition that what he'd stolen had value beyond its resale price. "I know I can't undo what I did," he continued. "I can't give you back the money or the peace of mind or the years where you had to worry about whether I was lying to you. But I want you to know that I see it now. I see what I did to you, and I understand why you had to protect yourself from me." We talked for 2 hours, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was talking to my son rather than negotiating with someone who wore my son's face. He didn't ask for money, didn't request immediate forgiveness, didn't try to manipulate me into resuming my role as his crisis manager. Instead, he asked about my life. About the book club, about my art classes, about whether I was happy. When I told him about the changes I'd made, the boundaries I'd established, the peace I'd found in prioritizing my own well-being, he nodded with what looked like genuine understanding. "I'm glad," he said. "I'm glad you stopped enabling me. I'm glad you chose yourself, even though it must have been incredibly hard." As I drove home that day, I felt something I'd forgotten was possible, cautious hope. Not hope that David would magically transform overnight, but hope that real change might be possible, that the relationship between us might someday be rebuilt on a foundation of mutual respect rather than one-sided exploitation. But I also felt something even more important. I felt proud of myself. Proud of the boundaries I'd maintained, proud of the growth I'd achieved, proud of the woman I'd become at 73 who valued herself enough to demand better treatment from the people who claimed to love her. A year passed. David completed his residential program and moved into a sober living facility. He got a job at a restaurant, started slowly, washing dishes and working his way up to prep cook. He called me every Sunday, not to ask for anything, but to check in, to share small details about his week, to ask about mine. I remained cautiously open to rebuilding our relationship, but I never wavered on the boundaries I'd established. He didn't have keys to our apartment. He didn't have access to our financial information. When he visited, which was rare and always by invitation, Frank and I maintained awareness of our belongings and our emotional energy. It took time to trust that his change was real rather than another performance designed to regain access to resources. But gradually, through consistent action rather than promises, David demonstrated that his transformation wasn't just about getting clean, it was about becoming someone capable of genuine relationship rather than perpetual manipulation. The real test came during the holidays. For years, Christmas had been a minefield of David's expectations and our attempts to create normalcy despite the underlying tensions. This year, he showed up with a small, wrapped gift, nothing expensive, just a book about addiction and family recovery that he thought I might find helpful. "I know you've been going to therapy," he said as I unwrapped it. "I thought you might like to read about other families who went through similar things." It was a small gesture, but it represented something profound, consideration for my experience rather than focus solely on his own needs. For the first time in decades, David had given me something that was actually for me rather than something that served his purposes while masquerading as generosity. That Christmas, we had what felt like normal conversations about normal things. David talked about his job, his roommates at the sober living house, his plans to eventually move into his own apartment once he'd saved enough money. I talked about my art classes, about a watercolor painting I'd completed that Frank had insisted on framing and hanging in our living room. There was still awkwardness, still the careful navigation of people learning new ways to relate to each other. But there was also something we hadn't had in years, the possibility of authentic connection. 2 years after I discovered the hole in David's bedroom floor, I made a decision that surprised even me. I forgave him. Not because he'd earned it through some predetermined amount of good behavior, but because carrying the anger and resentment had become more burdensome than releasing it. Forgiveness, I learned, wasn't about trust. I could forgive David for the pain he'd caused while still maintaining appropriate boundaries about future interactions. I could feel compassion for his struggles without accepting responsibility for solving them. I could hope for his continued recovery without making my own happiness contingent on his choices. The hole in his bedroom floor had been repaired, the floorboards replaced and sanded smooth. The room itself had been transformed into my art studio, a space filled with easels and canvases and the kind of creative chaos I'd never allowed myself to indulge in before. Where David had once hidden evidence of his betrayal, I now created beauty from pigment and imagination. Sometimes, working on a painting in that room, I thought about the metaphor. The secret space beneath the floor had held deception and stolen goods, but it had also held the key to my own liberation. In discovering David's betrayal, I'd been forced to confront my own role in enabling it. In protecting myself from his exploitation, I'd learned to value myself in ways I never had before. 5 years have passed now since that morning when Tony the electrician whispered, "Ma'am, you need to see this." David has been clean for 3 years, employed for 2.5, living independently for 18 months. He's dating a woman named Sarah who knows about his history and supports his recovery. He calls me every Sunday, visits monthly, and treats me with the respect I should have demanded decades ago. But more importantly, I've become someone who demands that respect. I've learned the difference between love and enabling, between support and sacrifice, between being needed and being used. I've discovered that setting boundaries doesn't make you a bad person, it makes you a person who understands their own worth. Frank and I celebrated our 50th wedding anniversary last month with a small party in our apartment. David was there, along with Mrs. Rivera and the women from my book club, along with friends from the community garden and my art class. Our home was filled with people who cared about us not because of what we could provide them, but because of who we were as individuals. During the party, David pulled me aside for a quiet moment. "Mom, I want you to know something. The person you became when you stopped enabling me, that's the mother I always needed but was too sick to appreciate. Thank you for loving me enough to save yourself." I looked at my son, this man who had caused me so much pain and who had worked so hard to rebuild himself into someone capable of genuine love, and I felt something I'd thought was lost forever, pride in both of us. Here's what I want you to know, if you're listening to this and wondering whether your own story sounds familiar, it's never too late to choose yourself. It's never too late to set boundaries, to demand respect, to stop confusing love with exploitation. The people who truly care about you will rise to meet your standards. The ones who don't weren't really in relationship with you anyway, they were in relationship with what you could provide them. I spent 73 years learning this lesson, but the knowledge has transformed the remaining years of my life in ways I couldn't have imagined. I wake up each morning knowing that my day belongs to me, that my choices are my own, that my love is a gift rather than an obligation. Sometimes people ask me if I regret the years I spent enabling David, if I wish I'd set boundaries sooner. The honest answer is complex. I regret the pain, the financial losses, the way I diminished myself in service of someone else's dysfunction. But I don't regret the journey that led me to authentic self-respect and genuine relationship with my son. Those hidden items under the floorboards, they weren't just evidence of David's deception. They were a mirror reflecting my own need to examine the foundations of how I loved, how I gave, how I related to the people closest to me. Sometimes the most devastating discoveries are also the most liberating ones. I'm 78 now, and I spend my days painting watercolors of the changing seasons, reading books that challenge my thinking, tending tomatoes in the community garden with Frank. David visits regularly, not because he needs something from me, but because he enjoys my company. We have the relationship I always dreamed of, but it only became possible when I stopped accepting less than I deserved. The woman who found that lockbox under the floor, who cried over the broken pieces of her illusions about motherhood, she was breaking apart so that a stronger version of herself could emerge. Sometimes we have to lose the relationships we thought we wanted in order to build the relationships we actually need. My story isn't unique. Across the country, there are parents dealing with adult children who've lost their way, who've confused family love with unlimited support, who've weaponized guilt and obligation to maintain access to resources while providing nothing but stress and heartache in return. If that's your story too, I want you to know, you have the right to protect yourself. You have the right to set boundaries. You have the right to demand that love be a two-way street. It took an electrician finding hidden evidence of betrayal to wake me up to patterns I'd been enabling for years. But sometimes the most painful discoveries are gifts in disguise, opportunities to examine our own lives and make the changes necessary to transform surviving into thriving. But let me tell you about the hardest part of this journey, the part one haven't talked about yet. The part that kept me awake at night for months after I first set those boundaries. It wasn't David's anger or his attempts at manipulation. It wasn't even the guilt I felt about abandoning my own child, though that was certainly crushing at times. The hardest part was facing the truth about myself. About how I'd used David's neediness to feel important. About how I'd confused being indispensable with being loved. About how I'd derived a twisted sense of purpose from constantly rescuing someone who didn't want to be saved. Dr. Martinez helped me understand something that shattered my whole worldview. I'd been addicted to. Not to substances, but to being needed. To the drama and crisis and constant emergency that made me feel like the most important person in someone's life. I'd been enabling David's addiction to maintain my own addiction to being his savior. Margaret, she said during one particularly difficult session, what if David had gotten clean years ago? What if he'd become self-sufficient and independent and stopped needing your constant intervention? How would that have made you feel? I sat in her office, surrounded by tissues and the gentle hum of the white noise machine, and realized with horror that part of me would have felt lost. Unnecessary. Without the purpose that his crises provided, who was I? What was my role in the world if not fixing my broken son? I whispered, I think I would have felt abandoned. So in some ways, you needed him to stay sick. You needed him to stay dependent. His recovery would have threatened your identity as much as his addiction threatened his life. The truth of it hit me like a physical blow. While I'd been congratulating myself on my endless sacrifice, I'd actually been participating in a sick dance that kept both of us trapped. His addiction fed my martyrdom fed his addiction. We were two people drowning together, each pulling the other deeper underwater while believing we were helping. That revelation sent me into a depression deeper than anything I'd experienced since my father's death 40 years earlier. For 3 weeks, I barely left my apartment. I called in sick to book club, canceled art classes, and spent most days in bed staring at the ceiling and wondering if everything I'd ever believed about love and family was a lie. Frank tried to comfort me, bringing me tea and sitting quietly beside me when words felt impossible. Mrs. Rivera knocked on our door daily with food I couldn't eat and gentle questions I couldn't answer. The women from book club sent cards and flowers, offering support I felt too ashamed to accept. Because what do you do when you realize that your love, the thing you thought was pure and selfless and holy, was actually selfish and controlling and toxic? What do you do when you understand that your greatest acts of generosity were actually elaborate performances designed to maintain your position as the indispensable fixer in someone else's broken life? It was Dorothy from book club who finally broke through my protective shell of shame and self-loathing. She showed up at my apartment one Thursday evening with a thermos of soup and a determination I recognized from our group discussions. Margaret, she said, settling herself at my kitchen table without invitation, I'm going to tell you something I've never told anyone else. I sat across from her in my bathrobe, feeling like a ghost haunting my own life. When my daughter Jenny was in the worst of her addiction, stealing from me and lying and putting me through hell, I used to fantasize about her dying, Dorothy said quietly. Not because I wanted her dead, but because I imagined how tragic and beautiful her funeral would be. How people would look at me and see this grieving mother who had loved so deeply and sacrificed so much. How I would finally be the center of attention for the right reasons instead of always being embarrassed by her behavior. I stared at her, shocked by the raw honesty of the admission. I was horrified when I realized what I was thinking, she continued. But my therapist helped me understand that it wasn't really about wanting Jenny dead. It was about wanting to be seen as the good one, the victim, the saint who had endured so much. I was more invested in my role as the suffering mother than I was in Jenny's actual recovery. How did you get past that? By accepting that love isn't always pure. That even our best intentions can be contaminated by our own needs and fears and insecurities. By understanding that recognizing these ugly truths about ourselves doesn't make us monsters, it makes us human. Dorothy stayed with me for 3 hours that night, sharing stories from other women in similar situations. She told me about mothers who had bankrupted themselves to maintain their roles as saviors. About grandparents who had custody of grandchildren not out of pure love, but because it gave them purpose and status and a reason to feel superior to their adult children. About families where dysfunction had become so normalized that healing felt like abandonment. The hardest thing to accept, she said as she prepared to leave, is that we can love someone and still participate in their destruction. We can have good intentions and still cause tremendous harm. But recognizing these patterns is the first step toward changing them. That night, for the first time in weeks, I called Dr. Martinez and scheduled an emergency session. I think I need to start over, I told her. I think I need to learn how to love people without trying to fix them. But I don't know if I know how to do that. It starts with learning to love yourself, she said. With developing an identity that doesn't depend on being needed by someone who's perpetually in crisis. We began what she called identity work, the slow, painful process of discovering who Margaret Patterson was beyond her role as David's mother and crisis manager. It meant revisiting my childhood, examining the patterns I'd learned from my own parents, understanding how my mother's martyrdom had shaped my definition of love. I realized that I had never seen healthy boundaries modeled. My mother had sacrificed everything for her children, working multiple jobs, going without food so we could eat, wearing the same dress for years while making sure we had new school clothes. She'd worn her sacrifice like a badge of honor, and I'd internalized the message that love meant self-destruction in service of others. My father had been absent, not physically, but emotionally. He went to work, came home, ate dinner, and retreated into his workshop in the garage. He never engaged with our problems or emotions, leaving my mother to handle everything related to family relationships. I'd learned that men provided financially while women provided emotionally, no matter the cost to themselves. No wonder I'd been drawn to Frank, a quiet man who worked hard and left family management to me. No wonder I'd accepted David's treatment of me as normal. No wonder I'd confused enabling with loving. But understanding the origins of my patterns didn't immediately make them easier to change. I had to learn new ways of being in relationship, new ways of showing love that didn't involve sacrificing myself on the altar of someone else's needs. I started with small steps. When Frank complained about his chronic back pain, instead of immediately researching solutions and scheduling doctor's appointments for him, I listened with sympathy and asked what he wanted me to do to help. When Mrs. Rivera mentioned that her grandson was having trouble in school, instead of offering to tutor him or research programs or solve his problems, I simply said, "That must be difficult for you. I hope things improve." It felt awkward and unnatural at first, like holding back a sneeze. My instinct was to leap into action, to fix and solve and manage. But gradually, I began to notice something incredible. People didn't seem to need my constant intervention as much as I'd thought they did. Frank was perfectly capable of managing his own healthcare. Mrs. Rivera's grandson worked through his problems with the help of his teachers and parents. The world continued turning even when I wasn't frantically spinning it myself. Most importantly, I began to develop interests and activities that had nothing to do with other people's needs. My art classes became more than just a way to fill time, they became a source of genuine joy and self-expression. I started volunteering at the community garden not because someone needed me to, but because I enjoyed working with my hands in the soil. I read books because I was curious about the stories, not because I was looking for solutions to other people's problems. For the first time in my adult life, I began to discover who I was as an individual rather than as someone defined entirely by my relationships to others. The transformation didn't happen overnight. There were setbacks, moments when my old patterns reasserted themselves with startling intensity. But each time I chose differently, each time I asked, "What do I need?" instead of, "What does someone else need from me?" The new way of being became a little more natural. David called during this period of intense self-examination. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me pick up. "Mom?" His voice was different again, smaller and more uncertain than I'd heard it in the coffee shop months earlier. "Hello, David. I wanted to let you know I finished the residential program. I'm in a sober living house now, and I got a job washing dishes at a restaurant." "That's good. I'm glad you're making progress." There was a long pause, and I could hear the familiar sound of him searching for the right words to elicit the response he wanted from me. I was wondering, could we maybe have dinner sometime? I'd like to tell you about what I've been learning in therapy. The old me would have immediately said yes, would have started planning the meal and worrying about his comfort and trying to create the perfect environment for his continued recovery. The new me paused and considered what I actually wanted. I'd be willing to meet you for coffee, I said finally. Somewhere public. For an hour. To see how we both feel about spending time together without any expectations about what comes next. Another pause, longer this time. Okay. Coffee would be good. We met at a diner near his sober living facility. David looked better than he had in years, healthier, more present, less like he was constantly calculating angles. But I maintained my emotional distance, listening to his updates about therapy and work without immediately jumping into cheerleader mode. I've been learning about something called trauma bonding, he said as we sat in the fluorescent-lit booth. How people can become addicted to dysfunction because it's familiar, even when it's harmful. I nodded, thinking about my own recent revelations about my addiction to being needed. My therapist thinks maybe we had that, you and me. That maybe we both got something out of the chaos, even though it was destroying both of us. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw something I hadn't seen in years, genuine self-reflection rather than manipulation disguised as insight. I think she might be right, I said quietly. I want you to know that I understand why you had to cut me off. Why you had to protect yourself from me. I was using you, and you were letting me, and it was making both of us sick. We talked for exactly 1 hour, as I'd specified. No longer. And when our time was up, I didn't automatically schedule another meeting or make promises about future contact. I simply said, thank you for sharing that with me. I hope your recovery continues to go well. As I walked back to my car, I felt something I hadn't expected, peace. Not the desperate hope of previous conversations, not the crushing disappointment of unmet expectations, but simple, quiet peace. I had met with my son, heard his updates, and maintained my boundaries. I had shown up as myself rather than as the person he needed me to be for his comfort or recovery. That evening, I called Dr. Martinez to process the encounter. How do you feel about how it went? She asked. Powerful, I said, surprising myself with the word. I felt like I was making choices instead of just reacting to his needs. That's tremendous growth. You maintained connection without losing yourself in the relationship. Over the following months, David and I began to develop a new kind of relationship. We met monthly for coffee, conversations that lasted exactly 1 hour and focused on mutual updates rather than his crises or my solutions. He never asked for money or help with practical problems. He seemed to understand that access to my time and emotional energy was a privilege he had to earn through consistent respectful behavior. Most importantly, he stopped trying to make me responsible for his feelings or his progress. When he had a bad day at work, he didn't call me expecting to be soothed or fixed. When he struggled with cravings or depression, he used the support systems he'd developed in recovery rather than turning to me as his primary emotional regulator. For my part, I stopped monitoring his moods or viewing his setbacks as reflections of my success or failure as a mother. His recovery became his responsibility, not mine. His happiness became his job, not my obligation. The relationship we built was quieter than what we'd had before, but it was also healthier. It was based on who we actually were rather than who we thought we were supposed to be for each other. Meanwhile, my own life continued to expand in ways I'd never imagined possible. I joined the Community Gardens Planning Committee, helping to design new raised beds and organize seasonal planting schedules. I started taking watercolor classes and discovered I had a talent for capturing the subtle changes of light throughout the day. I even began writing in a journal, documenting not just events but my thoughts and feelings about them. Frank and I took our first real vacation in 15 years, a week-long trip to visit my sister in Florida. For decades, I declined her invitations because I felt I couldn't leave David alone for that long, couldn't risk missing an emergency that might require my intervention. But with our new boundaries in place, I felt free to focus on my own relationships and desires. You look different, my sister Carol said as we sat on her back porch watching the sunset. Lighter somehow. I thought about all the weight I'd been carrying, the responsibility for David's choices, the chronic worry about his future, the exhausting vigilance of constantly monitoring his moods and needs. Letting go of those burdens had indeed made me lighter, freer to move through the world without the crushing weight of someone else's life on my shoulders. I stopped trying to save someone who didn't want to be saved, I told her. And how does that feel? Terrifying and wonderful, I admitted. Like I'm learning to breathe again after holding my breath for 30 years. The book club, which had become such a source of support during my darkest period, continued to provide wisdom and perspective as I navigated this new phase of life. We'd moved beyond just discussing literature to sharing our own stories more openly, creating a circle of trust where we could examine our relationships and choices without judgment. One evening, we were discussing a memoir about a woman who had ended her relationship with her narcissistic adult daughter. The parallels to my situation were obvious, but so were the differences. The hardest thing to accept, said Helen, whose own story of setting boundaries with her son had inspired much of my journey, is that not every family story has a happy ending. Not every relationship can be saved, even with therapy and boundaries and good intentions. But some can be transformed, added Maria, whose grandson had eventually moved out of her basement and was now supporting himself. Sometimes enforcing boundaries creates the space for people to grow into who they're supposed to be. I thought about David's progress, his continued sobriety, his steady work at the restaurant. Our monthly coffee meetings had become something I actually looked forward to rather than dreaded. Not because I was constantly worried about his welfare, but because I genuinely enjoyed the man he was becoming. I think the key, I offered, is learning to hope without attachment. To wish someone well without making your own happiness dependent on their choices. The group sat quietly for a moment, absorbing the complexity of what I'd said. That might be the wisest thing any of us has ever said in this room, Dorothy said finally. As my 78th birthday approached, I found myself reflecting on the incredible journey of the past few years. The woman who had discovered those hidden items under the floorboards seemed like a different person, someone I could feel compassion for, but not someone I recognized as myself anymore. That Margaret had been so afraid of being alone that she'd accepted abuse disguised as need. She'd been so afraid of being unimportant that she'd attached herself to someone else's crisis and made it the center of her world. She'd been so afraid of being selfish that she'd sacrificed her own well-being on the altar of someone else's dysfunction. This Margaret, the one who painted watercolors and tended tomatoes and set boundaries with love, was someone I was proud to be. Someone who understood that loving yourself isn't the opposite of loving others, but the foundation that makes healthy love possible. David called on my birthday, right on time for our monthly coffee invitation. Happy birthday, Mom. I was wondering if maybe, instead of meeting at the diner, you'd like to come see my new apartment. I paused, considering the request. 6 months earlier, I would have been terrified by any change to our established routine, afraid that deviation meant regression. But I'd grown more confident in my ability to maintain boundaries regardless of the setting. I'd like that, I said. As long as we keep it to our usual hour. His apartment was small but clean, sparsely furnished but obviously cared for. He served me coffee in mismatched mugs and showed me photos from his job. The restaurant had promoted him to prep cook, and he was clearly proud of his progress. But the moment that took my breath away came when he handed me a small wrapped package. I know we don't usually do birthday gifts, he said, but I wanted you to have this. Inside the box was my mother's wedding ring. I stared at it, unable to speak. The ring I'd thought was lost forever, the piece of family history I'd grieved giving up. How did you? I began. I've been saving money for months, he said quietly. I tracked down the pawn shop, found out who bought it, and convinced them to sell it back to me. It took forever, and I had to pay 3 times what I got for it originally, but I wanted to return it to you. Not because I expect forgiveness or because I want something from you, but because it belongs with you. I slipped the ring onto my finger, where it settled like it had never left. But more than the physical object, what moved me was the gesture, the months of saving, the determination to make amends not with words but with action, the understanding that some things are worth more than money. Thank you, I whispered. Thank you for teaching me that love sometimes means letting go, he replied. And for showing me what respect looks like by demanding it from me. As I drove home that day, my mother's ring catching the light on my finger, I felt something I'd never experienced before, complete peace with my choices as a mother. Not because my story had a fairy tale ending, but because I'd finally learned the difference between loving someone and enabling them, between supporting someone and losing yourself in their chaos. The Margaret who had enabled David's addiction while feeding her own need to be needed was gone. In her place was a woman who understood that the most loving thing you can sometimes do is refuse to participate in someone else's destruction, including your own. That night, as Frank and I sat at our kitchen table sharing a piece of birthday cake Mrs. Rivera had brought over, I looked around our small apartment and felt grateful for everything it represented. Not the dreams of a bigger house or a different life, but the reality of a partnership built on respect, a community of friends who valued authenticity over performance, and a relationship with my son that was finally based on mutual care rather than desperate codependence. Any regrets? Frank asked, following my gaze around our modest home. I thought about the question, really considered it. Did I regret the years of enabling? The financial losses? The emotional turmoil? The slow process of learning to value myself? The pain of setting boundaries and holding them even when it felt like abandoning someone I loved? No, I said finally. I don't think I'd change anything. Because all of it led to this, to knowing who I am, to having relationships based on respect instead of need, to understanding that love and boundaries aren't opposites but partners. Frank smiled and raised his water glass in a mock toast. To Margaret Patterson, who learned to save herself. I clinked my glass against his and felt the truth of those words settle into my bones. I had learned to save myself. And in doing so, I'd created the space for everyone around me, including David, to learn to save themselves too. Have you ever discovered something that completely changed how you saw a family relationship? Have you ever had to choose between enabling someone's dysfunction and protecting your own well-being? Have you ever learned that the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in someone else's destruction? Please share your story in the comments below. And if this resonated with you, if it reminded you that you deserve respect and boundaries and genuine love rather than manufactured obligation, please like this video and subscribe. Because healing happens in community, and your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to begin their own journey toward authentic self-respect.